Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on from where you are. It's David Carr from the Herald newsletter, coming to you from Belgrade, the capital of the world. And in this video, the Gordian knot of Ukraine, the impasse, the unsolvable problem. What is the West doing about it? Are they helping or are they hindering? I seem to be having some technical issues and problems with my camera, so I hope I manage to make it to the end of this recording. Um, if I don't, I'll have to abandon it. But if you're actually seeing it, it means I succeeded and I managed to upload it to YouTube. It's Sunday, the 7th of September, and I picked out a headline from the British Daily Telegraph from 2 days ago, from the 5th of September, and it says as follows. I'm going to try and put it on the screen as well. And it's a journalist called Owen Matthews. I might have encountered him before, I can't remember. But Ukraine is on its own. Europe is all talk, no action. Well, um, I'm not sure I entirely agree with him. I think Europe would very much like to take action, but they really can't take action beyond sending money to Ukraine, which presumably they've been doing. And the reason is um, there are many leaders in Europe, and particularly Emmanuel Macron of France and Keir Starmer of Britain, and I think Friedrich Merz of Germany, who would very much like the opportunity to send troops to Ukraine, not necessarily in a combat role, but in a supportive role, which would free up more Ukrainian troops to confront the Russian invaders. The problem is, of course, is that um, Vladimir Putin won't agree to this. And by uh, the lights of the Russians, it's unacceptable. The reason Russia, of course, invaded, the rationale for invading Ukraine in the first place was the threat of Ukraine being invited into NATO. And Russia's made it abundantly clear that they will not tolerate NATO troops in Ukraine. So that's a major problem. And I'm going to read a bit of this article because it's quite interesting. Europe is lying to Ukraine. There will be no troops coming to its rescue. Yesterday's meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, this is the loose coalition of countries put together by, I think, Keir Starmer, and maybe Joe Biden as well when he was president, Trump possibly as well, Macron, this Coalition of the Willing, countries who claimed that they would be willing to send troops as part of a sort of peacekeeping force. Um, Coalition of the Willing yielded much bold talk, including an agreement in principle to what French President Emmanuel Macron called reassurance forces in Ukraine. It's just another word for peacekeeping forces. But there's one problem with Macron's plan, and his name is Vladimir Putin. Europe's leaders have refused to talk to the Kremlin ever since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, which may explain why they seem not to have heard Putin's often repeated message that he adamantly opposes the idea of a NATO military presence in Ukraine. Um, Again, it goes on. That makes Macron's plan for putting European boots on the ground part of the problem, not part of the solution. Putin will never agree to NATO peacekeepers, so why are the Europeans even talking about them? The only answer is another empty show of solidarity with Vladimir Zelensky, who did a great deal of glad handing and hugging of his European friends. The article goes on to explain that Zelensky and all Ukrainians have good reason to feel very angry at their allies in the European Union. And I think that's true to some extent because, as far as I can see, the West in general, America and the EU, has led Ukraine down what's called the Primrose Path. I think they promised them NATO membership, EU membership, to be sucked in as part of the Atlantic Alliance, armed them, trained them, but really turned them into a weapon to be used against Russia. And that was a very bad idea, no matter what you feel about Russia. And that's now come home, of course, to haunt the whole of Ukraine and haunt the whole of Europe. So the problem is here that Europe can supply weapons. Indeed, they have supplied weapons. I think most European inventories are now empty. However, putting troops in is very difficult for several reasons. First of all, Europe doesn't have the armies to do it. They just don't have the manpower. They certainly couldn't take any active part in the fighting realistically without American support. And Donald Trump has made it clear that he will not give that support. So the European countries would be on their own. It would be really France, Germany, Britain, I don't know, maybe Italy, possibly Poland. I think the Poles have ruled themselves out. And they don't have enough troops. It's as simple as that. So that's one problem. The other problem is the Europeans want to agree a ceasefire leading to an eventual peace agreement. But the Russians don't trust this because what they claim is that the West will use a ceasefire to simply insert troops into NATO, into Ukraine, and fresh supplies for Ukraine, and more money and more weapons, and it will simply prolong the war. And there probably is some truth in this. However, the Russians say we want a comprehensive peace agreement first and then a ceasefire. So why can't we have a comprehensive peace agreement? Because it looks like it's impossible. Russia has made it abundantly clear that they are never going to surrender even 1 square meter of the territory that they have captured. They too have expended blood and treasure to take it. They're not giving up even a square meter, a square millimeter, nothing. They won't go back an inch. I've mixed imperial measurements with metric measurements there. I hope you'll forgive that. So any peace agreement must involve making some territorial concessions to Russia. Would certainly be Crimea, would certainly be Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, maybe Kherson regions as well. Altogether, it's something like 15 or 18% of Ukrainian territory. But the problem is the Ukrainians will never agree to surrender their territory. Constitutionally, it's impossible. And Zelensky, if he tried, if he even looked like he was going to agree to surrender any Ukrainian territory to Russia, he would be deposed and possibly assassinated. So there's the impasse. There's the problem. The Russians won't back up. The Ukrainians won't back down. The unstoppable force, the immovable object. So there's not going to be a ceasefire because the Russians won't agree to one. That means Western troops are not going to be inserted into Ukraine in any sort of coalition, and by whatever name you call them, whether you call them peacekeepers or reassurance force, it's just not going to happen. And Europe can't afford it, and they haven't got the troops anyway. So there's lots of reasons why Ukraine is on its own. And there's other reasons why this Gordian knot, this impasse between Russia not backing down and Ukraine not willing to give up a millimeter of land, that means, unfortunately, whatever conferences are held, whatever assurances are given, the war in Ukraine will have to grind on to its military victory. I should have said military conclusion. One side or other has to win. Either the Ukrainians have to succeed in pushing the Russians out of Ukraine, which at the moment looks very unlikely, or the Russians have to succeed in wrestling Ukraine to the ground and finally putting them in a position where their supplies and their weapons and their manpower are just exhausted and they can't carry on, and then imposing a peace deal. Who knows? It may go as far as Russia conquering more territory, maybe Odessa, Nikolaev, maybe Kharkiv as well, and then leaving Ukraine as a kind of rump state without a coastline and no access to the Black Sea. The Ukrainians, of course, look like they're fighting bitterly to prevent this, but at the moment, they don't seem to be able to push Russia back. So this war grinds on to its military conclusion, no matter what they say in Europe. Okay, well, anyway, thank you for listening. It's a grim subject, but it has to be discussed. Um, I write about Ukraine and this war and Russia quite extensively in the Herald newsletter, and there's a link to the Herald newsletter in the description below. So please, click on the link and subscribe to the Herald newsletter. Geopolitics and international affairs, your front row seat to history delivered to your inbox. Once again, I think I've got to ask you to, if you can, subscribe and hit the like button or the notification bell or both. I'm not sure how it works. You probably know better than I do. I hope wherever you are that you have a good day.